and that protection was given was sought to be given through the constitution itself. That was a big break. So, it could not be confiscated, it could not be taken away from them, and that gave a lot of security to the capitalist spirit, that if you earn more and more profit, it will accrue to you, it will be with you, it cannot be taken away from you, and it is almost equal to liberty, security, and resistance to oppression. Now, resistance to oppression as a natural right is a revolutionary step, in the sense that the immediate backdrop of this revolution is feudalism, right. So, then no less important is the fact that, as per this document, articulating the aspirations of the revolutionaries, sovereignty was to rest in people. So, sovereignty earlier rested in the monarch, in the king, right. Now, it was to rest in people. That means that when people decide through constitutional means in the designated fora, which in French case is the National Assembly, then there is no power on earth that could change it, or there is no power on earth that could coerce it to change it. So, the people of France are free to decide for themselves as to what they are going to do. So, that is sovereignty, right, and that was to rest in people. Again, it is a major departure from the feudal ethos. Similarly, in the first stage, we also find that laws or provisions were made where the church land was confiscated, and it was confiscated with the purpose of serving as collateral for the newly launched currency in France, that was assignat. Now, as all of us know that paper currencies require some collaterals, it could be in the form of gold or some wealth, and in French case, the confiscated church land as a consequence of the revolution was to serve as a collateral for the newly launched currency in France, and alongside that, we also have the civil constitution for clergy, and this civil constitution of clergy is to be understood with reference to again the earlier practice, where it was the papacy, it was the Pope, it was from Rome that the rules and dictates of church governance came all across countries in Europe. And now, it was not through some religious head, but it was made subservient to a civil constitution, and the religious part of it is gone. So, obviously, this was a big break, and those serving in different capacities and in the across the hierarchies in the church obviously were not amused, and in fact, despite having taken several blows in terms of reputation, the Catholic Christianity still had some bit of respect and hold over people's imagination, to the extent that this particular step of the government, where the clergy was made subservient to civil constitution, actually generated a lot of support for the counter revolution, those who did not want revolution, those who were opposed to these revolutionary changes. So, in some segments of the peasantry and some sympathizers of the monarchy or royal order or the conservatives actually see this particular change as the reason as to why they got disenchanted with the revolution. Then, over and beyond this document, we have the new constitution 1791, which was the first constitution that France made for itself. it could never be implemented, all right. Nevertheless, what was contained in it allows historians to understand the aspirations and the nature and character of the revolution in the first stage. And if we study the new constitution of 1791 in France, we get this impression that this particular document or constitution testified the position now held by the dominant order. So, although it was all being made in the name of common people, the third estate, assertion of the third estate, and even the poors will matter as equal as anyone who is rich or from the first two order. Despite all these claims, as per the constitution, it seemed that it stamped the position that the dominant order held in France. So, the government, of course, had the monarchy had discredited itself, and it had just been a limited monarchy at this point of time, and supreme power virtually was a monopoly of the well-to-do. So, as I told you towards the beginning, that still France is not a republic. Still the king is there, but he is just like a puppet, he is just like a prisoner of the revolutionaries, and it is the well-to-do amongst the third estate or well-to-do people who actually were running the show. And this is what is the picture that we get from this constitution of 1791. So, the sense of democracy and participation had perhaps not percolated to the lower order of the third estate, and that it is the rumbling in the lower order of the third estate which will take France from first to second stage. Now, looking at the economic and governmental changes in the first stage of the revolution, we find that the church land that was sold off actually was parceled into bigger units, and obviously only those who were well off could buy it. Had it been parceled into smaller units, it could have perhaps been more democratic, and more people could have bought it and could have benefited out of it. But the sheer fact that the chunk of land that was carved out of the confiscated church land was big, therefore, only the well-to-do could buy it, and these are the ways by which the monopoly and access of the well-to-do to the levers of power were maintained. Similarly, the traditional institutions like guilds and trade unions also were done away with. Guilds obviously protected the interest of the particular community of carpenters, traders, or whatever of diverse pursuits. But it was it did not allow competition. It did not allow competition within itself, within the guilds. Now, that ran counter to the ethics of capitalism, and therefore, and we all know that it is the bourgeoisie that is driving the revolution at this point of time, at least till this point of time, and therefore, guilds and trade unions were stumbling blocks here, and they were done away with. So, the assertion of bourgeoisie is very prominent in the first stage. Then the local governments also were restructured, and this was done obviously to do away with any aristocratic domination that were surviving till around that point of time. France was divided into 84 departments or provinces as we know them popularly, and all local officials were to be elected locally. And this ensured that the French Revolution actually began with the spirit of decentralization, and this decentralization was also an assertion of individual liberty and freedom from ancient privilege. So, why I am saying this is because there is some kind of a reversal in the second stage of all these things. For example, the last point that I discussed about decentralization actually goes on to make a U-turn and in the second stage of the French Revolution, it is a centralized picture of France that we get to see. Now, what are the reasons and what are the factors behind this that we will see in the second part of this lecture. However, it is important for us to remember that in the first stage, to begin with, the revolution started with the spirit of decentralization. It was a federal kind of republic or constitutional monarchy that was conceived by the bourgeoisie or the well-to-do amongst the third state, who were actually propelling the revolution to begin with. That is why they are also ensuring that the democratic institutions or liberal institutions of parliament, in French case, read it as the National Assembly, they get entrenched in French politics, and it is through these legislative deliberations that these changes were sought to be brought about. Why these things are important is because even today in the democratic liberal regimes, we agree and we presume that people's will is exercised through representative institutions, that is the parliaments of different countries or legislative institutions of different provinces within a country, right. And any segment over and beyond this can also make occasional claims to represent people's will, but that is not accorded legitimacy in the liberal regime. So, democracy works all right, it has an intent, but it is a particular process that it has to follow. And in the first stage, we find that bourgeoisie, French bourgeoisie is trying to bring about these changes. They were revolutionary all right with respect to the antecedents of France, but they were not as revolutionary as the people on the streets were expecting. And people on the streets were expecting more radical measures, and there was this perception gaining ground amongst the mobs or people on the streets of Paris, that these legislative changes have not touched their lives. Their yearnings have not been addressed, and that it is that angst that shows its ramification in the intensification or in the radicalization of the movement. And when that radicalization starts happening in France, we today tend to study them as the second stage of the French Revolution, and that is what we shall be talking about in the next part of this lecture. Thank you. Good afternoon, viewers. Welcome to this series of lectures on modern European history. So far, we have discussed the syllabus outline, usually the way it is dished out to the students at the undergraduate level across universities in India of modern European history. From around the beginning of the French Revolution to around the middle of the 19th century, the semester-wise categorization or semester-wise arrangement of modern European syllabi. We have discussed the intellectual background of the French Revolution. We have discussed the immediate causes of the French Revolution, and in the earlier part of the discussion today, we have also seen the progression of French Revolution in its first stage. Let me clarify that depending on what your perspective is, the French Revolution that began in 1789 is supposed to be unfolding in different stages all across the 1790s, right, almost till the emergence of Napoleon in 1799, and the entire stretch from 1789 to say 1799 is understood, is studied by historians today in different stages, and obviously these stages have their own attributes, as we discussed earlier, that the first stage was the stage where the well-to-do amongst the third estate or the bourgeoisie is calling the shots, and they are the ones who are the main propellers of the revolution, and whatever changes that they are bringing about in terms of doing away with feudal privileges or aristocratic monopolies and privileges, they are being brought about through the institution of National Assembly that they had created on the eve of the revolution. So, it is the representative institution of the National Assembly through legislative measures that they were bringing about changes. They were phenomenally revolutionary changes with respect to what the situation was in France in its feudal stage. Nevertheless, there is an element of angst that can be detected amongst the lower order of the French society, particularly the urban dwellers and people say in Paris, the petty shopkeepers, the workers, the small writers and so forth, who somehow thought that despite this euphoria about this revolution, the fact of the matter is that even the price of essential commodities, particularly that of bread, couldn't come down to their affordable stage, and they were still finding it tough to buy essential items, particularly bread. So, some kind of a perception had gained credence amongst the particularly amongst the lower order of the French society, that the revolution actually was benefiting only the well-to-do, and it was not benefiting them, although the entire moral power of the revolution was in the name of the third estate and those who were at the lowest rung of the third estate, but they were perhaps not benefiting much. So, the second stage, the timeline, of course, is 1792 to middle of 1794. That is when we have the emergence of the Directory period. That marks the beginning of the third stage of the French Revolution. So, if we look at the second stage of the revolution from 1792 to 1794, we find a massive radicalization of whatever steps had been undertaken by revolutionary France. Remember, in the first stage, the iconic document Bill of Rights of Man and Citizens had been produced. Feudal taxes and other exemptions, taxation exemptions had been done away with. They were fairly remarkable changes, and France had given to itself the first constitution, and this constitution guaranteed the right to property alongside liberty and right to take measures against oppression and so forth. But by and large, it were the moderates who were running the show. It were the well-to-do amongst the third estate who were running the show in the first stage, and they were whatever changes were brought about were being brought about through legislative measures in the National Assembly. And as I said that somehow people on the streets felt that it is not for them and it is not benefiting them. So they rose they rose very vociferously and violently to this, and the form that the revolution takes as a consequence of this is what we are going to study in this discussion. That is the second stage. This marks the second stage of the revolution, where the Jacobins are running the show, where sans-culottes that I have spoken to you earlier about as to who they were, they are the ones who are calling the shots. They are the ones who actually are generating pressure on the Jacobin leadership to bring about measures, and we shall see as to what those measures were, right. So the second stage largely sees the moderate leaders increasingly being replaced by the radical Republicans, and obviously even the radical Republicans who are replacing the moderate leaders are claiming to rule on behalf of the common people. And even the earlier ones, the moderate leaders, were also claiming to rule on behalf of the common people, but now it is the radical segment of the leadership that becomes more prominent. Now, how these changes are being brought about? What are the reasons? Largely three, and you can see on your slide as to what those three big reasons were. First, that I had already hinted at, and this is the politically literate lower classes, and they were writing pamphlets, they were printing pamphlets. So they had grown disillusioned with the slow, incremental, very limited bandwidth of changes that were brought in the first stage. Free enterprise, which as a principle, which as an economic principle was furthered by the bourgeois-led revolution till around the end of the first stage, had led to increased bread prices, right. There was no protection that was available for the poor in the market, and as a result of it, the bread prices and other essential commodity prices increased. Obviously, this created a lot of pressure on the urban dwellers, particularly those who were at the lower rungs of the third estate or lower rungs of society. So the urban rioters would very vociferously start demanding cheaper bread, and this was one of the most formidable demands by the people on the streets. And obviously, in a market driven economy, how to bring this about, how to make the breads cheaper. Obviously, they thought that the government should exercise control. Now, this would mean that the government will have to cut into the spirit of free enterprise. Government will have to intervene, which in classical capitalist society it should not. But that is what the lower order is demanding, that the government take control of economic affairs and bring the prices of bread down, right. And they also realized, the lower order during this stage had also realized that there was a lack of effective voice in the operation of their new constitution. So, whatever deliberations were being made in the National Assembly or Constituent Assembly, they were largely benefiting the well-offs. And even if you look at the social profile of the deputies, now deputies are the people who are elected to these national assemblies as a consequence of elections. If you see their profile, and I have spoken about it in my earlier discussion, you will get this impression, you will get this idea as to what I am talking about. Most of them are well off, and they are either professionals or well off people, right. They certainly are representing the poor, but they themselves came from a different kind of social background, although they all came through elections, right. So, this sense of disillusionment drove the people on the streets in a restive mode, and that was one reason as to why radicalization of the revolution is happening in the second stage. Second reason you can cite is the lack of effective national leadership in the initial years of the revolution. We all know that Louis XVI as a character had severe lacunae. He was a weak monarch, he was a vacillating monarch. 1791 incident where he was trying to flee along with his wife, probably to Austria, where he had a monarchical dynasty which was associated with his family. So he was a king, he was the king of France, and yet was feeling very unsafe in France and wanted to leave the country. Of course, in disguise, he was caught, he was nabbed and virtually brought back as prisoner. Thereafter, all these things had given a death blow to the reputation, to the centuries-old reputation of monarchy. Similarly, Louis XVI was seen as being overtly dependent on Mirabeau, who had distinct aristocratic lineage, and he was not a popular figure. People did not like the idea of their king depending on an aristocrat, that too Mirabeau. And Mirabeau had died towards the end of the first stage, and that could also have added to or could have also aggravated problems for Louis XVI. 1792, the third reason that I was talking to you about could be the war situation. Please remember that whatever was happening in France in the first stage initially was celebrated by several scholars, thinkers, artists, musicians across Europe with a lot of sense of positivity and enthusiasm. But the moment France declares war against the neighboring countries, the neighboring monarchies, that support of people waned or started waning. Also because of the radicalization of the revolution. So, the initial euphoria with which the revolution had begun, perhaps the revolutionaries had radicalized it to the extent that some of the liberal supporters of the revolution, even outside France, felt dejected by it. We know of Wordsworth, who had earlier supported the movement. Now, obviously, he was disenchanted with it. Several other romantic writers who had earlier seen the revolution with a lot of sense of promise, now were fairly disillusioned. We know of Beethoven. By the time he sees Napoleon embarking on his political project of empire building, he too withdraws from his support to the revolution. What I am saying here is that as the neighboring countries felt that the revolution is going to be a problem for their own countries, in the sense that it would incite some kind of disturbance against the monarchical order that was already there in these countries, France had to declare war on them, because the supporters and sympathizers of monarchy, the émigrés, were fleeing France and settling in these countries, particularly Austria, and from there they were supporting or inciting or fueling the counter revolutionaries, right. So that initial support that you get to see in the forms of say personalities like Wordsworth, von Herder, or patriot groups in the Low Countries, that is the Netherlands, present day Netherlands, who were also, for example, this patriot group in Netherlands, inspired by the revolutionaries, were trying to create disturbance for the oligarchy, trading oligarchy that was present as governance or present as a governance mechanism in these countries. Now, this step of France going to war with the neighboring countries obviously ensured that this support, also the international support or the European support outside France, also waned. So this also has to do with the counter revolutionary attempts by the émigrés and conservatives, who obviously did not want the revolution to succeed, because it had radicalized too much and was threatening their own existence. We all know of the famous debate between, or that is how we as students understand the ideological clash as part of the French Revolution, Edmund Burke versus Thomas Paine. Edmund Burke was a British parliamentarian and commentator who wrote as an observer of the French Revolution. He had some acquaintance in France who would regularly write letters to him, and in much before the second stage of the revolution, he wrote a book by the name Reflections on the French Revolution, and that book went on to become the bestseller for next 2 decades. And this book was conservative in a stance. It did not approve of radicalization of the revolution. Edmund Burke says that revolution is a monstrous crime against the social order. People cannot be reduced to being constitutional abstractions endowed with an objective set of natural rights. So it's a stinging critique of what the Enlightenment writers had visualized as the future politics and future shape of citizenship. France, as I said, was increasingly being understood or seen as a threat to international stability, because it was threatening the monarchical order in countries outside France. Thomas Paine, who had penned the Rights of Man and the Citizens, is a vehement supporter of the revolutionaries. So Thomas Paine and Edmund Burke represent two polarities of viewpoints regarding the revolution. One is for it, Thomas Paine is for it, Edmund Burke is against it. He represented the conservative stance, which was espoused by the counter revolutionaries. Then we also have the war politics. 1792 onwards, France was at war with the neighboring states, and we have declaration of Pillnitz in 1791 between Austria and Prussia, which declared France as the common enemy. And in April 1792, the assembly obviously had declared war against Austria and Prussia, and we have already discussed as to why the international support for the revolution actually started waning. We also have political factions in France, the Girondins, who were in power at this point of time. I would say they were in majority in the National Assembly in the first stage. The reactionaries, that is the conservatives, and the extremists, that is the radicals, they are all supporting the war. Why they are supporting? They are supporting it with different objectives. Girondins thought that in the name of war and patriotism and national crisis, people, the vociferous tendencies of France would coalesce into one, and that would accord durability to their rule. So, for them it would mean France going to war would mean some lease of time for the Girondin rule, Girondin formidable presence. The reactionaries thought that well, if France goes to war with the neighboring countries, then neighboring monarchies would defeat France, and if France is defeated, then monarchy would be back, and therefore the conservatives thought that their political aspirations would be better met with, right. So, the counter revolutionaries were supporting war because of this, and the extremists, the radicals, thought that, well, the initial reverses that the French army of course was facing, they thought that this would discredit the Girondins who were in power at this point of time, and this would catapult this initial reverses of the French army would catapult the extremists to power in the National Assembly, and therefore all were supporting the war. And on the threat to Paris from the invading power, the Parisian rioters, the people on the streets who had nothing to do with what was happening in the National Assembly in August 1792, actually attacked the Royal Palace, seized the municipal government in Paris, and replaced it with a revolutionary commune. And it all started demanding king's imprisonment. It is from here that we find that the second phase begins, and it is more about Jacobins versus Girondins. Jacobins representing the radical ideology of the revolution. It also called for elections by universal suffrage of delegates to a national convention, which was entrusted with the task of drafting and enacting a new republican constitution. It is this convention which became the effective governing body of the country for the next 3 years during the Reign of Terror. And September 21st, 1792, France declares itself as a republic during the second phase. 1793 January, the king Louis XVI, who was no more a king, he was just a citizen, Louis Capet, and he was executed, guillotined. Then we have the iconic measures during the Reign of Terror in the second stage, which tells us as to how one can see the elements of socialism here. That is the law of maximum, which is maximum retail price of essential goods. This was provided for. The government actually cross-subsidized the grocers to ensure that the common people, the people on the street, the poor, get affordable price for their essential commodities. This did not succeed. Nevertheless, these measures were put in place. Sans-culottes is the one, or sans-culottes are the one who are actually dictating terms, and Jacobins are the ruling faction, but essentially it is the sans-culottes demand that they have to meet law of suspects to ensure that there is no unpatriotic works, conscriptions, subjecting religion to reason, making religion as the private affair in 1794, etc. So, these are, and then subsequently we have army successes, and you can see the details of that in this slide. And all these things actually provided rationale for the emergence of the radicalism in the second stage. But as France started winning wars, the raison d'etre, the reason for these extraordinary measures, which were antithetical to the aims and objectives with which the revolution had begun, started fading. And it is in the light of this that we find that the second stage also came to an end. by the middle of 1794 with the guillotining of the entire battery of leadership that French Revolution had produced. So, that will mark the end of the second stage, and from there on begins the third stage that we shall undertake for discussion when we meet next for another discussion. Thank you.
Historians have acknowledged my glory. The discussion about the beauty of Kashmir is incomplete